Today, I want to take you all to a specific place. Looking at these sun-drenched communities and exquisite luxury estates, you might think we're in California's Silicon Valley or perhaps an old money neighborhood in Boston. But this isn't California. This is a city that, in the last century, was one of the most coveted destinations for global tech talent. This was the Silicon Valley of its day, the innovation hub of a previous era in American history, Rochester, New York. For people in Silicon Valley, this place is actually quite familiar. Steve Jobs' favorite motto, "You press the button, we do the rest," was born right here in Rochester. And today, Silicon Valley is frantically pressing another button, artificial intelligence. Amidst the layoffs and industry obsolescence, Silicon Valley has begun to realize that it isn't just technology being rewritten this time. It's the fate of cities and our collective future. The prophecy for that future may well be written in the history of Rochester. Today, let's step into this former American capital of innovation, a city that has already completed its cycle of destiny. Let's see where a city might go after a technological revolution, and where we should go when faced with a new turn of fate. In Rochester, there is a street called East Avenue. The trees are perfectly manicured, and the houses are stunning. There are no tourists, no noise, and none of the house hunting frenzy you see in California. Yet 100 years ago, the people living here enjoyed the most dignified lives in America. They were the world's top engineers, innovators, and entrepreneurs. Their wealth wasn't built on connections or political lobbying. It came from the tool they were most proud of, technical innovation. In that era, living on this street meant you stood at the absolute forefront of the age. You had a stable job, a high income, ample opportunities for social mobility, and a future that no one doubted. People believed the glory would last forever because Rochester held the world's most cutting-edge expertise in imaging, optics, and manufacturing. New patents and factories emerged every day. You could say the vision of the world's future was being manufactured right here. Many young people came here determined to dedicate their entire lives to this city. And they did, indeed, live the lives most envied at the time. Spacious, detached homes, a stable upper-class lifestyle, and children attending private schools. Life's trajectory seemed pre-written. How could they not be happy? Until one day, the technology shifted. What first made people doubt the future wasn't their property values. It was the disappearance of jobs. Tasks that once required a massive number of engineers were taken over by new technical systems. Then came the department cuts. Then came the sight of colleagues and eventually themselves being laid off. Some clung to the illusion that this was just an economic cycle, that if they just waited, things would warm up again. Unfortunately, those jobs never came back. This is the cruelty of life. You didn't do anything wrong. You still worked hard. It's just that the times changed. In a new era, hard work can sometimes be futile. Even more cruelly, the cause of it all was the very creed they believed in. You press the button, we do the rest. Their own fates changed along with it. As friends in Silicon Valley surely know, when the first person to say those words pressed that button, they set a specific destiny in motion.
At the light, turn left onto East Avenue.
In the eastern part of Rochester, there is a house that looks like a wealthy residence, just slightly larger than a typical detached home. It was here, over 100 years ago, that someone wrote the line that would define the direction of innovation for the next century. You press the button, we do the rest. These words came from the founder of Kodak, George Eastman. In those days, photography was an incredibly complex skill. You had to buy expensive equipment, master complicated focusing and lighting, and handle the chemical developing and processing yourself. Back then, photography belonged to only one class, the wealthy. Only the rich could afford to hire a photographer. Eastman achieved what seemed impossible at the time. He hid all the complex steps of photography inside a single box. You didn't need to understand anything, just press a button, and it was all handled. From that point on, photography entered the lives of ordinary people. Regardless of wealth or status, everyone could enjoy the benefits of technology. The tech tree that Eastman unlocked also led humanity to a civilizational turning point. From then on, humans stopped trying to understand complex logic and technology. The evolution that followed was simple. The easier it became for the user, the more complex the system became. However, as the systems perfected themselves, the people who actually understood them were optimized out by the technology. Over the next century, Eastman's philosophy of innovation was taken to the extreme. Polaroid invented the instant camera. Sony invented the pocket-sized Walkman. Xerox created the graphical user interface that eliminated the need for a keyboard. Then came Steve Jobs. He had a bold idea. I want all of those. Touch the screen, we do the rest. The iPhone was released, and it virtually wiped out all consumer digital competitors by putting everything into a palm-sized box. If Eastman is looking down from above, I think his greatest pride wouldn't be founding Kodak, but rather sparking the mind of Steve Jobs. Jobs, in turn, used his personal charisma to spread this philosophy throughout Silicon Valley, evolving eventually into today's AI. Now even Silicon Valley is feeling lost. The AI button has been pressed. Who will it make unemployed? Which cities will be reshuffled by technology? Rochester has already lived through all of this. What does a former tech capital look like now?
In 600 feet, turn right onto Commercial Street.
Leaving Eastman's former residence, I wanted to see a Rochester landmark, a city spectacle that few have seen: High Falls. Few cities have a massive waterfall planned right in the heart of their downtown. Not far away is the Kodak headquarters. You can imagine this as the Apple Park or Google campus of a previous era. It shows just how prestigious Rochester was back when it was fueled by Kodak. Regarding why Kodak declined, some say it was short-sighted management or lagging R&D. But few realize that the world's first digital camera was actually invented by Kodak. Their downfall wasn't because they didn't understand the direction of technology. On the contrary, they were the most faithful executors of Eastman's philosophy: press the button, leave the rest to the system. If you step away from an engineer's mindset and look at those words, you realize they represent a bug. As the buttons we can press increase, the things humans actually control decrease. Where then is human value? During the era of film, producing Kodak film required massive chemical plants and thousands of workers. On the consumer side, you had photo printing chains, service staff, R&D manufacturers, and maintenance networks across every city. This entire ecosystem supported the city's economy. Rochester was literally sustained by Kodak. Kodak faced a dilemma that outsiders rarely understood. The moment they invented the digital camera, they realized that the faster technology innovated, the faster Rochester's economy would be destroyed. Think about the tech giants in Silicon Valley. When you invent a system, the priority is always to compress human nodes. What does that mean? It means cutting people to reach the next iteration. To a consumer, this sounds great because labor costs drop and products get cheaper. But for a local city, it's devastating. You walk through the city center, the roads are wide and the buildings are dense, but there are no people. No people. Still no people, because the new system doesn't need people. Today's Silicon Valley faces a challenge perhaps even more brutal than Rochester's. In the previous manufacturing era, those optimized by the system were primarily blue-collar workers. But in the age of AI, the primary goal is to replace white-collar workers. In this new system, the greatest risk is no longer the machine, it's the person. Imagine we are the appendix of the human body. During evolution, once you no longer need the appendix, it actually poses a greater risk. If the appendix threatens the life of the body, it's the first thing to be cut out. To me, the Kodak building looks like a tombstone for a previous technological era. If Silicon Valley builds a tech museum 100 years from now, there might be an exhibit describing how, in our grandparents' time, humans actually had to hand code with their fingers. It would look like performance art.
Look at this. They called this manual coding.
Hilarious. I can't believe they actually used these ancient things.
When an industry is given a death sentence, the city's appearance doesn't necessarily collapse. Instead, it's like someone hit the pause button, freezing the streetscapes in time. But that isn't the whole story. When we drive south to the University of Rochester, the scene suddenly flips. Laboratories and hospitals are rising everywhere. This university feels like an urban arc. It answers a vital question. Why, when Kodak fell and Xerox declined, did the city of Rochester, seemingly sentenced to death, not actually die? The answer lies with George Eastman while he was still alive over 100 years ago. He made a fortune through Kodak, but he didn't pour all of his wealth into building more factories. Instead, he made the most important decision of his life. He endowed universities. One was the world-famous MIT, no explanation needed there, and the other was the University of Rochester. Eastman left virtually no personal inheritance. He gave everything to education. You can see from this that he didn't worry too much about Kodak's specific future. Perhaps he truly foresaw what was coming. Because he himself was a practitioner of disruptive innovation, he understood that his industrial empire would eventually be replaced, and Kodak would reach its end. But one thing is hard for time to render obsolete: the passing down of the innovation gene through education. Whether Kodak exists in the future isn't the most important thing. What matters is that the wealth generated by Kodak was invested into education. Today, the University of Rochester still houses one of the world's top laser laboratories. Its Cancer Research Center has the strongest imaging-targeted therapy technology in the country. Its Eastman School of Music is ranked in the top 3 for classical music in America. Through education, Rochester still has the chance to embrace the future. As the saying goes, you must have the ability to stay at the table forever. The two things that truly allow you to survive cycles are cognitive barriers and the ability to pass things down. If Silicon Valley faces a technological transition in the AI era, what kind of arc will it leave for the next generation? Perhaps the answer lies in an old photograph in Eastman's home. Visiting Eastman's home was actually a personal wish of mine. I went alone after my meetings. My mother was a professional photographer. In my memories when I was very young, I used yellow Kodak film canisters as building blocks to make houses. As soon as I entered his home, a lady roughly my mother's age specifically pointed out a room I had to see.
George Eastman left an indelible mark in Rochester and around the world.
He was a savvy businessman and offered his employees.
I followed her guidance and walked inside. I didn't see anything particularly flashy, just an unassuming photograph on the wall. It wasn't a groundbreaking ceremony for Kodak, nor was it a photo with a president. It was a portrait of Eastman's mother. Reading the description behind it, I realized that his lifelong drive to popularize photography had a very simple motivation. He wanted a simpler way to preserve his mother's face. In that moment, I understood. Though the technology in that box grew stronger and the profits grew larger, the starting point was a tiny, yet exceptionally precious, human emotion. I think many have forgotten the original intent of technological innovation. It wasn't meant to replace humans. It was meant to let humans live more like humans. 100 years later, many innovations have lost sight of this, obsessively pursuing efficiency and frantically optimizing systems. But when everything finally reaches perfection, we might look back and realize we no longer know where we are supposed to stand. It is a mirror reflecting the rise and fall of human civilization driven by technology. It shows us a possible future. If a person's only value is to optimize a tool, they will eventually become a tool themselves, and may even be optimized out. Eastman's famous quote, "You press the button, we do the rest." Perhaps the most important part isn't the rest, but the you. You, me, all of us. If in the future all work is handed over to AI as long as it preserves the most precious thing, the you, that would be true happiness. For some behind-the-scenes thoughts, when I walked out of Eastman's house, I sat there for a long time. I was shaken by the man himself. When he was young, starting Kodak, he had to wake up earlier than his employees and sleep later than his competitors. He worked harder in the places no one could see. He borrowed from his health during his youth, and in his final years, his life was very painful, plagued by illness. He was a man of great dignity and a perfectionist who didn't want to be a burden to those around him. He made a startling decision. He left a note that basically said to my friends, "My work is done. Why wait?" Then he took his own life. Reading that part was incredibly profound for me. Walking out of his home, I gained a new understanding of life. Whether it's Silicon Valley, New York, or anywhere on Earth, there are natural laws of life and death. No empire is eternal. But in the long river of human history, for a person to leave such a legacy, to be remembered so vividly and humanly over 100 years later, I believe that is a beauty of humanity that AI can never reach. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Don't forget to ring the bell so you don't miss the next share.